Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Mother's Day. My name is Brian Liddy, and as this is my first time here on Broadcasting Scotland, I just hope that you'll be patient with me today. Be kind also. Today we've got two excellent guests lined up. Rosemary Hunter, who's the co-funder of the Snowdrop campaign, is also an SNB activist and a member of the National Committee for Women for Independence. Rosemary is actually one of the first guests we ever had on Broadcasting Scotland. So welcome, Rosemary.
Good morning.
We also have Kirstein Rummery. Kirstein is Professor of Social Policy at the Stirling University, the University of Stirling. She's also a founder member of the Women's Equality Party and is a regular guest here on Broadcasting Scotland. So welcome, Kirstein.
Hi there.
So today, the first question that we have... Oh, yes, sorry, forgive me. Today's update on coronavirus figures. As of 2 p.m, on Saturday, yesterday, there were 639 new confirmed cases of COVID-19. Sadly, there were 8 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. 479 people were in hospital on Friday night, 38 of whom were in intensive care. There were 1,867,123 people who have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 156,250 people have received their second dose. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 1,739,203 people in Scotland have been tested. Of these, 1,530,135 tests were confirmed negative. 209,068 tests were confirmed positive. 7,508 patients who also tested positive have sadly died so far. So now we can get to more topical. Well, perhaps there's nothing more topical than COVID, but some of the issues that we've got lined up. The first one is the murder of Sarah Everard and the subsequent Reclaim These Streets campaign. You've probably seen on the national news and in the media that there have been clashes between the Metropolitan Police in London and peaceful protesters who want to make a statement following the sad death of Sarah Everard. So my first question, if I could ask Rosemary, do you think there's been the right balance between being struck between COVID restrictions and our rights to peaceful protest?
I think it's really difficult. There's still a lot of people who are very anxious about COVID and about the implications of people gathering. But I definitely think people have a right to show their or take on a response to this issue or to this sad death. What I'm picking up from it is that there was very little discussion or discourse with the police before the event, and they wouldn't actually engage properly with the organisers. And it does feel like if they had taken a little bit more effort to engage prior to this, then the outcomes would have been very different to the horrible scenes we saw last night on the news. I think it's extremely glaring, the difference between last week's protests, or not last week's, in theory, celebrations of winning a football season in Glasgow and the devastation to George Square that came from that, where police, I know it's the Scottish police force, but where very little was done to reduce the people in that square. And yet in London last night, we're seeing women held down by police people with their hands in behind their backs, etc. So it is difficult. There does need to be a balance, but I think more engagement beforehand could have made things very different.
Yes, I would agree, and I think maybe that makes it difficult in this time of a virus and a pandemic. It's difficult to arrange protests, peaceful protests in advance. So could I maybe ask you, Kirsten? I mean, just worth mentioning that even the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, in response to the Metropolitan Police action, said that it was at times neither appropriate nor proportionate, and indeed, even Priti Patel seems to have problems with how the Metropolitan Police handled it. So, do you have any thoughts?
I do, and like lots of us, I shared the kind of horror at what was happening in terms of policing at Clapham Common, which was not a protest; it was a vigil for a murdered woman, and there were plenty of opportunities for the police, as Rosie's pointed out, to engage with the organisers of the protest beforehand. It could have very easily been a very different outcome. We could have had women police officers there. We could have had socially distanced. We could have had stewards. We could have had agreed timescales. We could have had social distancing. The organisers were very, very willing to engage in those kinds of negotiations, which is what usually happens before planned events, all the time, but particularly in COVID times, it's really, really important. And the visuals of the Metropolitan Police holding down, grabbing and dragging away women who were there to remember a woman who was grabbed allegedly by a man working for that organisation are absolutely horrifying as well. And what it does throw up really is lots of questions. And one of the things is it was the tail end of what has been an absolutely horrific week for women. We started with International Women's Day and it's Mother's Day today. And in between that, we've had details coming out about Sarah Everard's murder. We've had backlash against, well, why was she walking home? Why was she doing this, that, and the other? Victim blaming, which we've all seen. We've had a pushback against that, which is quite rightly saying, women have the right to walk in public spaces, should have the right to walk in public spaces. One of the things that has particularly haunted me about this case is that the alleged perpetrator has also been charged with indecent exposure in a previous and unconnected case. Now, if the Metropolitan Police spent more time investigating cases of harassment, indecent exposure, abuse of women, then rather than going in and very heavy-handedly policing a peaceful vigil, then that could have had a very, very different outcome. Not just for that case, but for the hundreds and hundreds of cases that we know that police don't take up when women do report that they're being harassed, they're being stalked, they're being abused. The abduction and murder of a woman doesn't just come out of nowhere. It comes out of usually a very foreseeable pattern of violence against women. We need to start really taking this seriously. And it's not just about policing vigils in COVID. It's about the whole of the misogynistic attitude towards women. At the moment in the Scottish Parliament, we've got the hate crime bill going through and a really sort of sadly missed opportunity to take up Joanne Lamont's amendment on adding misogyny to what is a hate crime. Because what we do know is that the attitude to women fuels men's sense of entitlement, which fuels, again, small bits of violence which lead to larger violence, which lead to abuse, rape, abduction and murder of women. And it's an absolutely endemic problem. And it's not about changing the legislation. We've got quite good laws in place. They're not enforced. We know that when 95% of reports of rape to the police don't go any further, of those that do, very, very few result in a conviction. All of that needs to be addressed. And I do want to bring this up in terms of what's going through the Scottish Parliament at the moment, because this was a fantastic opportunity to send a message that misogyny is completely politically and legally unacceptable, and that's been missed. And the whole point of a hate crime is that it's a crime against not just that individual, but against the class and the group of people that that individual belongs to. So a homophobic hate crime is not just a crime against an individual gay person. It's against the whole of the gay community. And it's sending a message by saying that's a hate crime, that this is completely unacceptable. We've missed the opportunity to say that misogyny is completely unacceptable against women, but we know that misogyny is what leads to these kinds of crimes, not just happening, but not being detected, not being taken up, not being taken seriously when they do happen.
I think I agree. I concur with everything that you said there, Kirsten, and we can certainly. I'm happy to be corrected that it was a vigil, not a protest, and also we'll be coming on to Joanne Lamont and the hate crime bill. I'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit later on. But moving on to the next topic, which is indeed the passing of the hate crime bill at Holyrood, and also maybe the proposed new human rights bill, which was announced recently for Holyrood. Forgive me, sorry. Oh, yes, the hate crime bill and the proposal of the new human rights bill were both announced on the same day. Some commentators which noted that was there some significance in that, as perhaps it could have been combined. But Kirsten, as you brought up, you mentioned Joanne Lamont in the previous topic. Is there anything then that you would maybe want to link or use as a way into the passing of the hate crime bill, and maybe what that means for women and gender in particular?
It's a difficult and contentious problem because, of course, hate crime is a very complex issue. And watching some of the debates in the Scottish Parliament and picking up on some of these contentious and complex issues, it's really not a simple solution to a simple problem at all. But as I was saying earlier, the whole issue of why it's important to make things hate crimes isn't that things that were not previously crimes become crimes. It's that things that were crimes attract additional sentencing and additional punitive measures because they are a hate crime, because they are a crime against a class and a section of society. And of course, there's some really, really good progressive stuff in there about disability hate crimes, about homophobic hate crimes, about transphobic hate crimes. And there's a lot of issues around freedom of speech and issues around that. One of the things that is kind of quite noteworthy, and I think has attracted some attention from the women's rights community and the different elements within the women's rights community, is that you can, under the present proposals, a hate crime by, for example, misgendering somebody who's transsexual, etc., is on the bill. You can be found guilty of a hate crime against misgendering and all sorts of other things, but there is no misogyny on the hate crime bill. So you cannot be found guilty of a hate crime if you've directed that crime at a woman because she's a woman. And we know that most violence against women and girls is directed against women and girls because they are women and girls. Whether that's domestic violence, whether that's violence in the streets, whether that's harassment publicly or privately. And so it was, I think, for me, a little bit of a disappointment that Joanne Lamont's proposal to amend the hate crime bill to include misogyny was dropped. There is another option, of course, and this is being put forward, and Helena Kennedy's leading a review into this, whether we consider the whole issue of misogyny and crimes against women and girls separately within a separate bill, which isn't at the moment a possibility under the Scottish Parliament, certainly wouldn't be pushed through before the May elections. And that may well be a better way to do it because there are quite wide systemic problems about abuse, harassment, and the way in which that can escalate and lead to more serious crimes. But also I think we do have a problem socially, politically and culturally in accepting that the link between misogyny and crimes against women and girls. There's an awful lot of still, but despite years and years of women campaigning on these issues, not just women, lots of people campaigning on these issues to try and get the kind of structural links between misogyny, sexism and crimes against women and girls recognised. there is still this kind of endemic belief within the police service, within the judiciary, etc., that these are crimes of individuals against other individuals. So every domestic violence incident is treated as though it's one man who's suddenly lost his rag, and lots of excuses and mitigating circumstances are brought up against that. Every rape is one man doing it against one woman, and then there's an awful lot of issues around consent, etc. Now, you mentioned at the beginning that I am a founder member of the Women's Equality Party, and this is one opportunity, the elections, to do this, to start taking some of these issues and taking them to candidates at hustings across all political parties and asking them what it is that you are going to do about it. What policy options have you got to put forward? We've got a lot of progressive legislation within Scotland. The problem is it is not implemented properly. It's not, and the police, we can see. I mean, we say, yes, that the Clapham Common incidents with the Metropolitan Police, but we know that that could have just easily been any police force in Scotland. Decisions made on the ground about how we police women, and all sorts of stuff that was happening in the Sarah Everard case about, the things I was talking about earlier. Why was she alone at night? Why was she walking home? Why did she put herself at risk? That's endemic within the political and social discourse in Scotland as well. We are no more progressive than the rest of the UK in that regard. So, this is an opportunity for citizens to ask their potential candidates for Holyrood, what is it you're going to do about misogyny? What is it you're going to do? Because you obviously haven't voted on a hate crime bill that would include it. So what are you actually going to do to tackle misogyny? And just to plug, you can vote for the Women's Equality Party on the list in Glasgow and Lothian, but you can also look at those kinds of policies across the various constituencies and say, which of, for example, progressive policies across party policies, but particularly the Women's Equality Party, which of these policies that we know are about tackling misogyny, about tackling the endemic sexism in society that leads to violence against women and girls, which of these policies are you going to fight for in Scotland and are you going to implement?
Thank you. Rosemary, I'd like to ask you quickly Joanne Lamont, in the debate about the hate crime bill at Holyrood, she mentioned that she wanted to bring forward an amendment because she said that women are being asked to wait and to be patient, and women's issues will be, violence against women will be dealt with in the future with the upcoming new human rights bill. Earlier in the week, I was listening to a rival talk show, and one of the callers, a woman, recalled how when she was at school, she and her fellow female classmates were kept indoors while they were taught self-defense techniques that they could use against men that might accost them in the street. Meanwhile, at the same time, all the boys were outside playing football and rugby, and she asked, why wasn't the school, instead of teaching female students self-protection techniques, why weren't they teaching the boys about the correct way to treat women and females and to avoid the problem in the first place? So going back to Joanne Lamont, do you think the hate crime bill is a missed opportunity, or do you think it is better in general for people now that we do have the hate crime bill?
I think basically I think the amendment had value, but the fact is they're going to review that particular issue, take it offline, do some further analysis of it, and then, as far as I understand it, they have left it open so that misogyny could be added in at a later date. So I don't think it's completely off the table. I'm someone who would rather see good legislation produced than rushed legislation or badly thought through legislation brought into force. I think Kirstein makes a good point that you can have all the legislation you like. If following up on that legislation isn't acted on, or the police don't follow up on the legislation they have, then it's almost pointless having it on the statute book. And it's really interesting you mentioned the self-defence topic there. I was recalling when I was at school, and I was at a girls' school, that I think it was in fifth year high school, or fourth or fifth year, we were taken out, and I can't remember if it was the BBC, but somebody was doing a show on us, and they wanted to have us being taught self-defence, that being filmed and showing what a great thing it was that we were helping young women protect themselves. And I do remember some of the techniques, I'll be honest, that I learned that day. But it absolutely strikes me that you've got the not all men slogan coming through just now, which is really, really frustrating. It's like all lives matter. It's this, it's the same kind of idea where if you turn a blind eye, you're part of the problem. And I think, of course, it's not all men. The problem for women walking home late at night, or even not late at night, as Sarah Everard, 9 o'clock's hardly late at night. If she's walking home, or if any woman is walking home with their keys stuck between their hands, or panicking when they hear a set of footsteps behind them, or even pretending you're on the phone or being on the phone, if women are having to do that and continually living with a heightened level of fear, then there's a bigger societal issue, and I think we absolutely have to tackle that, and men have to take that on board too. And actually linking that with the misogyny situation, clearly I absolutely have been hit by misogyny multiple times over the years and over my life. But there are times when women can be just as nasty to women. And I think so it's about creating a culture where we're not all keyboard warriors or lacking responsibility for our actions or our words. And I think it's more important that people are pushed towards thinking about how they're behaving and what the impact of that. Stand in someone else's shoes for 5 minutes. Think what those words that you're about to use might, how they might affect you or the other person. And that way, hopefully, we can move things forward. So it's possibly a missed opportunity depending on what the further outcome is with that. As to the human rights legislation, I passionately hope that we can bring human rights legislation into Scots law. I am extremely anxious now that we're outside of Europe that Westminster will ride roughshod over what we have already. And if there's some way of us in Scotland helping to reassure our citizens that their human rights are maintained, then that has to be a really positive thing.
Thank you. Kirstein, we maybe have time to say a little bit more about the proposal for the new human rights bill. Have you any thoughts that you'd want to close this topic with?
Yeah, it is. Rosie has absolutely rightly pointed out that we have lost an awful lot of European protections in this case because of Brexit. And we haven't actually been, even when we had the opportunity since the Scottish Parliament in 1999, we haven't actually been as progressive as we could have been in terms of enshrining legislation in Scots law that would protect certain people against certain things. And I think this is a really good opportunity to kind of write that, and very timely as well, because what's going to happen over the next few years is we're going to be in an economy and social policy environment that is about COVID recovery, that is probably about austerity, that is probably about lots of things. And we know that disproportionately is going to impact on certain groups of people in society. And so the opportunity to enshrine protections in law before that starts happening, we've already seen it starting voting happening. We've seen the withdrawal of social care from disabled people. We've seen the withdrawal of care and supports from carers, disproportionate effects on women, disproportionate effects on particularly older women. And so it's really, really important opportunity to enshrine this in legislation while we can. And also, we did say previously, it doesn't really matter if you put things into legislation if they're not actually going to be implemented. It still sends a very positive and powerful message about what a society will and won't tolerate and what a society does believe in. And the fact that we are kind of pushing towards a human rights approach, and rights are enforceable choices. So this is about a set of issues, a set of rights and responsibilities that can be legally enforced by individual citizens against the state and against other people. That's actually a really important ideological and social message as well as a legal message.
Thank you. Moving on, Rosemary. Yes, Rosemary. We'd like to mention that yesterday was the 25th anniversary of the tragedy at Dunblane, and you, as a founder member of the Snowdrop campaign, played an incredibly important part in having handguns banned completely in the UK. But I've been looking into this. I remember it, but I didn't realise that your campaign had played such an important role in similar campaigns for similar mass shooting tragedies internationally. Is there, and we just mentioned about Scotland wanting to be a player on an international stage, but is there anything that you'd maybe like to say about that success of your Snowdrop campaign?
So I think one of the key points that I was discussing with somebody yesterday is the fact that back in '96, we didn't have computers to any degree. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have change.org where you could put a campaign up and people could fill in their email address and sign it. It was a very practical campaign. It was born out of overwhelming grief, really, that people in the town were feeling. And certainly in my case, it was a way of channeling some action to see if there was some way of supporting things moving forward, but in a legislative point of view. But I mean, I didn't get involved imagining for a minute it would end up at the situation or end up with the success it did, or with the support it did. But of course, you were dealing with a situation very unusual in the UK and even more unusual in Scotland. We know of mass shootings worldwide, particularly America, happen even now on a daily basis, multiple times often in America. It's more than one a day this year of mass shootings in America still. So, there were 17 families directly involved with it, plus who had lost someone, plus multiple others who had people who were, or children who were in the classroom and who were also affected. So there was a few people where the energy began, and you had the will to push things forward. But when someone's energy started to sap, there was often someone else was there who decided they could take on the baton and push, continue to push for change. So it felt that there was a wealth of support there between each other and between the families in order to keep pushing for legislative change. Obviously, at the start of it, the Conservatives were in government, and we'd asked John Major's government to offer a free vote on the legislation, which he refused, and whipped his MPs to vote against a full handgun ban. However, Labour, who were looking to take control of the government in the May election following in '97, had agreed that they would make it one of their manifesto commitments to introduce a full handgun ban. And on election, it was one of the first pieces of legislation they put through. In the UK and Scotland, we have definitely been safer, living in a more safe society because of that, from gun crime at any rate. And I think as people have come through, some people had the energy to continue campaigning, and then we've seen some of the younger generation now also having grown up as part of it, and now taking that forward and taking it across to America and pushing for stronger gun control over there. But it's just, in America, it's a really high mountain to climb. I just despair, to be honest, that there are more guns than people in America. So it's just really frustrating, the psyche of the American people for the right to bear arms. And even if they tighten their gun legislation, I mean, there's such a long way to go to get rid of guns off their streets and to reduce the gun crime that you see over there. But hopefully, I'm always an optimist, and I'm always hoping that we can continue to point out that this isn't what society should be. And again, in America particularly, yes, criminal incidents are horrendous and often premeditated, but it's all the incidental shootings. You've got a young 3-year-old picks up a gun and kills her sibling because it's lying about the house, and there's no controls over that, and yet the American society seems to think that's okay. So I'm relieved the UK doesn't have that, but it's extremely frustrating to think that in other parts of the world there is still that, I don't know, belief that it's a right, a human right. I don't see how a human right to own something which can cause the death of another human life just doesn't seem right to me.
There's just, it's hard to think of words following that tragedy at Dunblane, but Kirstein, is there anything that you would like to add in response to Rosemary's contribution?
Yeah, I'm with my Professor of Social Policy hat on. I'm actually teaching this week on policy development. And one of the really encouraging, lovely things to come out of the Snowdrop campaign was the lesson that actually a group of concerned citizens can make a fundamental, deep, lasting change to social policy. And it's awful that it has to come out of tragedy, absolutely awful that it has to come out of tragedy. But it does actually demonstrate that this myth that policy is made by, people in Parliament hundreds of miles away that have no connection to the local communities is absolutely wrong. Absolutely wrong. A group of concerned parents and citizens, etc., got together, and as Rosemary said, have had a significant impact on making all of our lives safer in the UK and particularly in Scotland. And I would just like to say, it's Mother's Day. Today is a really, really tough day to be the parent of a child who has been killed. And there are, as Rosie points out, thousands and thousands of parents in the US at the moment who are parents of children who have been killed by guns. And it is a huge mountain to climb in the US. It's not just about the American people, it's about the Constitution, it's about the legislative framework, it's about how difficult it is to get laws changed anyway. And in that respect, it is, in Scotland, we do have a much more collaborative, cooperative approach to policy making, where we do engage with civic society. And this is one example of where engagement with civic society has had a positive and good outcome. And it's also really, really heartwarming that it was done in a consensual way. It was done in building support. It was not done in an adversarial kind of fighting each other kind of way. It was actually making people come together and see the common aims, common good that could come out of it, that made that change in policy possible.
Thank you.
I think just to follow on a wee bit, Brian, with that, I think you're right about the adversarial part, in that the people who were supporting us weren't in any way adversarial, but we still had quite a vehement gun lobby who were really feeling we were impacting on their human rights. but it was the wealth, it was the overwhelming. People were stunned so much with what had happened that when we were offering people a solution to ensure that the same thing didn't happen again, well, not with illegal weapons, and that's the point. We banned handguns, and it is now illegal to own a handgun in the UK. So there will never be another tragedy. The point was the gunman in Dunblane legally owned those weapons and walked into that school with enough ammunition to kill every child in the school that morning. So that will definitely never happen again in the UK on a legal basis. But so people just really engaged with that and wanted to show support and to show that change could happen. And I absolutely agree with Kirsten's point about people even now think my voice doesn't matter, what I say doesn't matter. Even if I believe something or if I want something to change, no one's going to listen to me. And I think it does clearly demonstrate that a few people can make a difference. It might not be to the same level, but I think it's very important to let people know that your voice does matter. And as society, we should believe that voices do matter. And that kind of covers a lot of what we've already said today, in the topics we've covered. Often it's minorities. Hate crime bill is often around a minority group. So their voices do matter just as much as misogyny against women, who are the majority in the population, also matters. So I just think it's really important to focus on that, and to think, make sure people know their voice matters, and to try to encourage people to make their voices heard.
Yes, thank you. And I think you should be incredibly proud at the difference that you've made and the success of the Snowdrop campaign. Moving on across the Atlantic to the Black Lives Matter movement. This weekend, hundreds of demonstrators gathered in a rally and marched in Louisville, Kentucky on Saturday to mark the 1 year anniversary of the killing of Breonna Taylor, whose death helped fuel American protests against police brutality. And then the news about George Floyd's family receiving £27 million in settlement from Minneapolis, the city of Minneapolis, over his death. The trial is still going to go ahead, and I'm hearing on my earpiece that there's a jury selection is going on at the moment. Do you think? Thinking about the difference that the Snowdrop campaign made to something tangible and that affected gun laws. Have you any thoughts? Rosemary, on Black Lives Matter and how people can make a difference there?
I think the award of $27 million is significant. It's America again. People were kind of slagging America off a lot today, but I think where Americans have they always or often put monetary value ahead of a lot of other things, it feels like to me. So to grant or to award that amount of money is quite significant as far as looking at what has happened here, and significant for Black Lives Matter, and saying, look, this shouldn't have happened, and this person's family deserves this award. So I think it is. I think we're all sort of covered with a lot of these issues where, again, the voices should be heard, but people have been saying for years and years and years that Black Lives Matter, and yet it's only maybe now starting to filter through. Hopefully that is a significant amount of money that will impact on people's thoughts and psyche over there. And the police brutality is just, again, is extremely shocking. But while we might look at that there, to watch last night's situation in London and see the kind of force that was used against women in London, also just, it's still extremely worrying that these things happen, and that we're not, as a culture or as cultures, suggesting that this shouldn't happen anymore. Yeah.
Thank you. And Kirsten, as a professor of social policy, I'm sure that you've also got a lot of views on this topic. President Biden is a supporter of expanded gun control in America, but it looks like his legislation is going to face an uphill struggle. But again, I'd like to hear what you have to say or what you think on the matter.
Well, it's interesting to pick up on two things that Rosemary said that I absolutely agree with. One, when she was talking earlier about the Snowdrop campaign, back in '96, there were no hashtags, there was no internet campaign, things happened, and you were relying on the mainstream media to report them. And we know that the way in which the mainstream media reports things is within an institution that is itself endemically, because the whole of society is endemically racist, endemically sexist, endemically pushing against kind of minorities and things like that. And the big difference, and the other thing that I will pick up on what Rosemary says, because I'm feeling my age, I'm feeling very old, is that I remember police protests, Notting Hill, I remember riots in London, I remember all around, black communities experiencing violent policing, experiencing racist policing. Damilola Taylor's inquiry showed that there was endemic racism within the Metropolitan Police. And we still see endemic racism within the Metropolitan Police, although they have also taken on board the institutional responsibility to try and tackle this, and they are trying to do things. I think one of the contrasts, of course, Black Lives Matter, and the other one I'm thinking of course, is the kind of the hashtag Me Too campaign, which was about showing how endemic sexual harassment of women in the workplace, in public, in private, absolutely was, and people coming out and sharing their stories and realizing that this wasn't just individuals experiencing it, that sexism was absolutely endemic, particularly within certain industries, and we're going to draw a line in it, and we're going to stop it, and we're going to campaign against it. I mean, the contrast between Black Lives Matter and hashtag Me Too and Rosemary's Snowdrop campaign is Rosemary's campaign was trying to get a very relatively small but significant change in legislation happening. And what needed to go along with that legislation was also the acceptance that people owning guns is a bad thing. And now within UK society, actually, that was a pretty easy argument to make, because we had a clear and relatively unusual example of why that mattered. Even when we had handguns, we didn't have massive mass shootings the way we did in the USA, and this was one that was particularly awful. But people, as Rosemary pointed out earlier, people are killed every day by guns in the USA, but disproportionately, Black people are killed by guns, and Black people are killed by cops, and just to turn it back, I think there's been absolutely some fantastic work done from people of color in the US in terms of identifying systematic racism, teaching everybody about systematic racism, and demonstrating why it absolutely needs to be tackled. And the whole Defund the Police campaign was part of that, was part of trying to demonstrate that the police as an institution was supposed to be there to protect us. And we saw in Clapham last night, very, very much not there to protect us if we are certain members of society doing certain things they don't like. That those institutions need to own up and tackle their institutional racism, sexism, etc. And that's a much bigger problem to tackle. But the other thing is, we do have social media. We know what is happening in communities in America in a way that we would never know. But also, perhaps more importantly, to shine the spotlight back on us here in the UK, and particularly in Scotland, we know what's happening within Scottish communities. We know levels of violence against women. We know levels of violence against Black and ethnic minority communities are very high in Scotland. And we know that we need to tackle this. We also know that there is endemic structural racism within Scottish institutions, just as there are elsewhere. We've got no kind of massive, great, moral high horse to get on here. Just because the situation is perhaps less violent and there are fewer deaths doesn't mean it's not just as important. There is systematic racism, systematic also sectarianism, I would argue, within Scottish policing, and that needs to be tackled. And I think one of the main things that is also very, very different with the Snowdrop campaign is that we see politicians, particularly, again, let's place this in context, coming up for election in May, that are very aware of what's happening on Twitter, that are very aware of what's happening on social media, that these are voters, these are potential voters who are seeing what they're doing, seeing how they're acting. And so, a mayor of London or a home office minister who is supportive of police brutality or is trying to excuse police brutality is hopefully not going to get away with it. Hopefully the electorate will respond. But that is, and I think that one of the issues is we need to kind of harness that social media platform a little bit more effectively towards actually capturing and engaging with institutional change. And I don't think we've figured out yet as a society how to do that, but it is something that we do need to think about, in particularly at the moment.
Yes, lots of food for thought there. Thank you, Kirsten. I think it's important, just before we leave this topic, just to acknowledge that the Snowdrop campaign did have huge tangible impacts and has led to a safer United Kingdom, and so thank you for that. Hopefully, well, there's still lots to do, as we've all been saying, but hopefully the new hate bill and the proposed human rights bill in Scotland will similarly lead to tangible improvements for everybody. But one of the threads that seems to be running underneath what we've been talking about today is how COVID has meant that there are some things that we can't do in the way that we've normally done them in the past. It's difficult to meet in public and have large public gatherings. The same could be said with campaigning. Kirsten, you mentioned the importance of voting just there a few seconds ago. It's important that we all exercise our rights to vote. There's an important election coming up here in Scotland in May for Holyrood. And of course, COVID means that it's not possible to campaign in the traditional way, chapping on doors and the like. So the SNP this weekend has launched a weekend of action, which obviously is going to be online. They're asking people to tweet and to contact at least 20 people on Facebook and try and get people to vote for the SNP. It's the Tory conference this week, which is like all other parties, is also it's virtual this year. Rosemary, you mentioned how when you were running the Snowdrop campaign, we didn't have social media. What do you think about the possibility or the difficulties of how do we get news out there and get people to turn up and to cast their vote as they would do before COVID?
Yeah, it's certainly a strange situation that we're all in just now. I remember my granny was very adamant that I should always vote, and I don't think I've ever touched wood missed a vote so far. I thought as soon as I was able to vote, I voted in every election possible, and it's like, my granny telling me that Emmeline Pankhurst was chained to the railings and I should get out and vote. So it started off, I guess, that political drive. I think there's a lot of conspiracy theories around postal votes, and that's an issue, but actually it's a really good way to get to push for people to vote now if they're worried, because I think potentially even a few more weeks, even if the vaccine numbers are up and people feel a little bit more relaxed, there may still be concerns around going to a polling booth or too many people going at once or whatever. And so I think it's a good idea to encourage people to set up postal voting, and at least they can then put their cross on the paper well in advance of the date and get that sent in, or drop it into the polling station on the day if they want. I think that's really important. I think it will be interesting to see on the other side of this what the voting numbers are, because I think often real activists are thinking that it's all encompassing for an activist to go out and to do whatever, campaigning, chapping the doors, speaking to people, doing all of that. It feels it's a thing you want to do because you're passionate about getting your message out. But actually, for a lot of folk, they're not living that passion. It's like, oh, here's another leaflet through the door or whatever. So it'll be quite interesting to see how different, if at all, the numbers are in voting. But absolutely, it's also an opportunity to take to use the social media channels that we do have. I kind of find Twitter pretty toxic, I must admit. I try not to look on that too often, but I am very able and willing to engage on other platforms, and I think it's important to do that, to get your message out and to allow people to contact you as well. So, or to contact the parties, the various parties, they should be approachable. I think we also, however, have the issues around the kind of dark money that goes into a lot of political campaigning. And then we've seen, issues with the Conservatives funding, getting funding from left, right, and centre where they shouldn't really have had it, and it's very difficult to track that. So I think that's also an issue that we need to be aware of and we need to think about. And I guess if you're not that particular party, you need to be watching what they're doing and just checking into making sure that things are accurate that are being promoted online as well. So it frustrates me that the likes of Facebook don't really take sufficient action on that. And I know they're maybe trying to some degree, but it just still feels like the money wins again in these situations. But overall, I'm hopeful that people will engage. One of my children will be their first chance to vote this time, so that's quite exciting. Keeps threatening that he won't vote for me, but anyway, we'll see if he wants to get his tea. But anyway, so I'm hopeful that it will be a good uptake and people will make the effort. It's a really important campaign this time round. For those of us who are supporting independence, it's a real opportunity to send that message to Westminster to say that we want, or are insisting on having a referendum. Yeah, so I think it's an important election, and I'm hoping people will engage with that opportunity.
Thank you, Rosemary. I'm sure he will vote for you.
Well, I mean, I'll never know. It's a blind ballot.
Just tell me where he lives, Rosie. We'll go round and just look, vaguely.
It's in the bag. It's in the bag. Kirstein,
can I come in on that?
Sure.
Brian, is that all right?
Yeah.
There were a couple of things Rosie said there that really made me think. And Rosie and I obviously are campaigners, but for different political parties. And for both of us, I think this is going to be a real education in what happens when you can't go out and chap on doors, because that's what we've been taught to do. That's what we've been taught, to engage in those conversations. The other thing, of course, is that both Rosie and I are part of Women for Independence, which is about trying to do politics differently, trying to engage with people in a non-adversarial way. And I think one thing that we really need to bear in mind, yes, this is a make it or break it independence campaign for the Scottish Parliament, but also it's the post-COVID campaign. It is what is going to happen for the next constitution, for the next framework of the Scottish Parliament to try and bring us out of COVID and rebuild Scottish society in a way that is not endemically taking on board some of the systematic problems that we saw before. And to bring it back to campaigning, online campaigning is fantastically accessible for some people in a way that chapping on doors isn't. So as a disabled woman, I ran in the 2017 general election, and actually physically having to go around and do the chapping on doors was incredibly inaccessible to me. And that was really, really difficult. Sitting down in hustings was brilliant. That was absolutely perfect. You can tell I'm a bletherskite, so the opportunity to debate with other candidates. But hustings are really kind of relatively poorly attended. So the chance to get more people engaged in online hustings, online questions, and online debates. I know Rosie hates Twitter with an absolute good reason. Twitter is absolutely toxic for women. But for those of us who are on there, actually engaging in these debates in that way that is respectful, that is polite, but says things that hopefully will change hearts and minds to whatever party or whatever policy that we're campaigning on. Obviously, I really, really hope this is a fantastic chance for us to get our first Women's Equality Party candidate or candidates into the Scottish Parliament, which would make it a lot more feminist. But I'll move that on. That was my little political plug. But what I really do hope is we get, the other thing we're seeing is a lot of people standing down from the Scottish Parliament, largely due to, and certainly the women, the fantastic women from all political parties who are standing down in the Scottish Parliament, largely due to the real problems of combining working in the Scottish Parliament with caring, childcare, family life, etc. And also, in some of their cases, the toxic environment, the abuse that is heaped on women in public. Now, all politicians get stuff shoved at them in Twitter and it's nasty, but only female politicians get rape threats and death threats and targeted threats against their children and their families. And that is actually, the research that I've done indicates that is one of the key things that puts a lot of women off actually putting themselves forward and standing for Parliament. And there's lots of issues with why we haven't got a 50-50 parliament. And it's not all about not enough women putting themselves forward. It's also about the structures and the things. But one of the main things is that even though the Scottish Parliament actually is one of the most family-friendly parliaments that we have, it's still not friendly enough. It is still not accessible enough. So in terms of the fact that we're actually going to have to campaign differently, it might be an opportunity to start doing politics differently, to start making that whole, more accessible. The other thing I would say, it's not been highly publicised, disabled candidates use the access to elected office fund run by Inclusion Scotland to help with your support costs so that you can stand for Parliament. This was used, I think, last in the council elections, and it resulted in 15 disabled candidates across all political parties being elected. And one of the criteria for the access to elected office fund is that you have to demonstrate that without access to that money, you wouldn't be able to run. So that's 15 disabled candidates who otherwise wouldn't be in the public life, wouldn't be doing fantastic work in councils up and down the country. And we know that local authorities are doing dreadful, dreadful things in terms of social care, etc., under COVID. And the fact we've got disabled people at the heart of policymaking at local authority level is really, really important. Love to see more disabled people putting themselves forward. Some of the things that some parties have done, for example, the SNP, to encourage disabled people on list candidatures have actually been really progressive in this way. But we also know that, for example, the Tories do nothing to encourage women candidates, do nothing to encourage disabled candidates. So if they win more seats, we're going to see fewer women and fewer disabled candidates than we would otherwise. So it's just a message for all campaigners out there, all political parties. Take the opportunity of the things that you have to do under COVID to make it more accessible, to reach out, to get more people engaged in politics and more people not just voting, but campaigning and having the conversations that lead to good policy outcomes.
Well said, Kirsten. I think most of us would agree with everything that you said there. And absolutely, I know that I've been able to...
I just completely agree with Kirsten on that. And I just wanted to say, we're a bit late. We're a bit late for Holyrood to encourage, but now we need to have people starting to think about the council elections next year as well. And we absolutely need to encourage more people or more women, more minor,
ethnic minorities.
Yeah, you don't want another Westminster.
More ethnic minorities, more disabled people, more carers, more care experience. Absolutely. All the people that aren't normally in politics need to get in politics.
And
Agreed.
We just need to be doing that now and encouraging that now, rather than thinking about it next January when it's 2 or 3 months to go. So,
Yes, but thank you, both of you, for your contributions today. Thank you for your patience with me. Just to wish you all good luck in the upcoming elections. Hope you all do incredibly well in your constituencies. Thank you. So your regular viewers will be aware that we're in the middle of a fundraising campaign. If you can support us as a volunteer, if you want to take my place and get me off the airwaves, then that might be a good thing. Also, another way to support Broadcasting Scotland is to let us have some of any spare cash that you might have. Even the smallest amount would be much appreciated. So that's the end of the show, and thank you to both of our guests, to Rosemary and to Kirstein. Couldn't have done it without you. So goodbye.
The Catalans, the Basques, the Galicians in the Basque.
An independent future for Scotland.
How quickly do you think a referendum can be arranged?
Best practice demands that it should be 6 months.
Just looking at the overall share numbers for Scotland at the moment, the SNP 46.4%,